Hello students, welcome to Module 4.3.6, Speciation. Speciation is defined as the process by which two populations achieve reproductive isolation and become two different species. This is, of course, macroevolution. You should do a little bit of reading beyond what I'm going to give you here just to understand a little bit more in depth this process. It's very important. So here's it's a decent description of speciation from the University of Michigan. So paste that link into your browser and do a little bit of reading there, please. Now, before we can really understand speciation, we have to have some idea of what we mean when we use the term species. When I took a graduate course on speciation, we spent a good portion of it, 5 to 7 weeks, I don't remember exactly, just discussing what a species is. And for the purposes of our class here in Biology 1, or in our introductory biology class here, we're going to use the biological species concept, and this defines a species as a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. In other words, a species, this is again the biological species concept, it says a species is composed of a population whose members mate with one another and produce fertile offspring, or would do so if they came into contact, and population whose members do not mate with each other or cannot produce fertile offspring are said to be reproductively isolated and thus are members of different species. And so all those things say the same thing. And we are defining species here by sexual reproduction, and that works well for most vertebrates, but it doesn't work with all of other groups. For example, here's a few problems with the biological species concept, and that is that we're defining it by sexual reproduction, and many organisms can reproduce asexually. An asexual species must then be defined by their phenotype and biochemical analysis. A second problem is that hybrids occur in many plant and animal lineages. A third problem is for the paleontologists. There are many extinct species whose reproduction may not be observed, and so we can't really say who they mate with, and therefore the biological species concept is not very useful to them. And so these are just a few of the major problems that crop up with the biological species concept. Okay, when it comes to speciation, there are two general steps. First, isolation of two populations, and this stops gene flow, and second is genetic divergence leading to reproductive isolating mechanisms. And we're going to have another module in a little bit that will talk about reproductive isolating mechanisms. But for right now, what I want to do is I'm going to just give you an explanation, and you should draw this little drawing that I'm going to draw. We're going to have a population of some kind of lizard, and this lizard, it consists of, we're going to say, population A, population B, population C, and population D. Now here are the Charters Mountains, and here is the mighty Charters River that comes out of there. And what I've drawn here is pretty typical of most real species. They don't all occur in one population, but there's separated populations around. And of course, what can happen is in population A, we can have a mutation, and we'll call this the asterisk mutation. And I'll just make an asterisk, although you can hardly tell that's what that is. But as members of population A move over to population B, they'll carry with them the asterisk mutation. And as members go from B to D, the asterisk mutation will be spread, and from D to C, or actually from B to C, or we can have every possible. But the long and the short of it is every member of these four distinct populations, or every one of these four distinct populations, not necessarily every member, will then have the asterisk mutation in it because of what is called gene flow. Gene flow is natural immigration between populations which will actually share genetic variation, such as a mutation, such as asterisk mutation. Now suppose that there was a landslide in the Charters Mountains, there it is, and it caused the river to shift and instead of going that way, it went this way, thereby isolating population D, so it stops all gene flow. And that's what happens in this first step, is isolation of two populations. In this case, it's a population A, B, C are not isolated. They have gene flow among one another, and population D, which shares gene flow with none of them. And so then you can have genetic divergence. What does that mean? It means that after you have isolation, if we have over here the star mutation, it won't be shared with populations A, B, C. Or if we had the pound sign mutation over here, it will be shared with population B and population C, but not D. And so we see that gradually, in a genetic way, these populations grow apart. And that's what we mean by these two steps. Now, so isolation is the first step, and the second step is genetic divergence. And divergence means moving apart. And they move apart more if there is no gene flow. If there is gene flow, then they don't move apart at all because the genetic differences are shared, and there's not those differences between the populations any longer. So this is an important concept here, and you should have this in your notes and be able to explain it, because this really illustrates those two general steps of speciation. Here is an interesting biological example here in Arizona. These are tassel-eared squirrels. The one on the right is the A-bear squirrel. It's found south of the Grand Canyon in the city of Flagstaff. I used to have these in my yard when I was a graduate student at NAU. And on the left is a kaibab squirrel, which occurs only north of the Grand Canyon. And so this is actually an example of genetic divergence that's occurring because of isolation. This is a pretty good squirrel moat, preventing squirrels from running back and forth, I would say. We're not sure if these genetic divergences have led to reproductive isolating mechanisms yet, but that's where it might be heading. This actually shows another example. It shows an original beetle population separated. The blue line is representing some kind of isolating event so that the two halves here are no longer sharing mutations, they no longer have gene flow. And so we can see over time that you could get this divergence that would cause, and so if they came back together, they would no longer be infertile and not able to mate. And that's what a reproductive isolating mechanism means. These genetic differences have to be enough to cause reproductive isolation. And so let's talk about RIMs, or reproductive isolating mechanisms. There are two major categories of RIMs, of reproductive isolating mechanisms: prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic, remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. So these are mechanisms that act before a zygote is formed. So these prevent hybrid matings from happening. They prevent sex from happening, or prevent sex from being successful in producing a zygote. Postzygotic is hybrid mating has occurred, and they occur after the zygote is formed. So let's look first at pre-zygotic RIMs. Actually, we're going to stop right there, and that will be that module. And our next module will be talking about RIMs. So got a little excited there.